Hello everyone, and welcome to my final ESEA Main video of the season. Playoffs are on the horizon, unless I'm running late, and they already started. And we have 32 teams to discuss, as well as players to look towards for each team. A couple things before we start though. One thing I want to be very clear about here is that this is not a ranking video. I'll be going through each team one by one, from the 32nd seed to the 1st seed, in the order that they placed in the season. So don't get mad if I placed you 32, it's because you actually placed 32. This is also the most work I've put into a video like ever, so please remember that if I forgot to mention some detail, it's nothing personal. And if you feel like what I said about how your team might perform was wrong, the easiest way to make that clear to me is by pulling off some sick upset. In fact, I welcome it, as it means we get a more exciting postseason. With all that being said, please hit me with a follow on Twitter at Nova__FPS and follow CounterNature at CounterNature as they give me the platform I need to make these. Without further ado though, let's get into the rankings. The first team to discuss is the lowest seeded team entering playoffs, who only made it in off of another team losing their game. That would be Glacier. I actually had predicted before the season started that they would make playoffs as the 29th seed, so they basically ended up where I expected them to be. Even though they had only barely slipped into playoffs, making playoffs is way better than not making playoffs, of course, as now they at least get their shot at taking on the 1 seed, Gemini, in a best of 3 fashion. Glacier actually had a fantastic early season and an equally great end to their season, starting off going 7-1 and winning their last 3 games. This would typically make them 10-1, but with a heartbreaking 5-loss streak after their 8th game of the season, their season ended up looking much worse than it otherwise would have. There are many silver linings that Glacier have going into the playoffs, though. They have more experience beating playoff teams than many of the other low-seeded teams, with wins over the 12 seed, Materwelon, as well as a 16-8 win over Conquest, the 19 seed. They also have a pretty close result against the 6 seed East Coast Gaming. Unfortunately, with as many silver linings as they still have to play the most successful team in Maine thus far, who have only lost 2 games the entire season, and one of them was to the second highest seed. One final note is that while NTS is their best performer thus far, I'd have to make everyone else on the team my players to watch, as NTS cannot do it alone if they want to make this upset happen. If everyone else steps up and NTS keeps his form, they may be able to at least put up a fight. The outlook, though, is grim for Glaciers both in the real world and in ESEA Main, as I see this team melting at the hands of Gemini more likely than not. Daddy's Boyz end their regular season run 10-6 and claimed the 31st seed for themselves. The Boyz had a pretty average season for themselves, with their most notable win coming in the form of a 16-11 over Undesired Prophecy, the 28th seed. But with losses to the likes of HighQ, In Review, and Mach 5, if there's one thing Daddy's Boyz know how to do, it's lose to playoff main teams. Having to face off against the 2 seed Aqualix Esports in the first round sounds like a recipe for a quick boot to the lower bracket for the team, and I can't find too much to prove to me that that isn't exactly how things will go. One interesting fun fact I did find out about this team, though, is that 3 of their players all ended the season with 81 ADR. My players to watch for this team, then, has to go to the triplets Hyrix, Carter, and Anax for having the same ADR. In all seriousness, though, I would love to see this team put up a fight versus Aqualix, but they will have to dig deep to make it happen. Good luck to them. The team formerly known as Ascendance, IzunE Fan Club are probably more surprised to see themselves in playoffs than anyone else. Having already made roster changes and posting their LFT ads, the team now faces main playoffs out of nowhere, barely slipping in as the 30th seed. They managed to revive their season after some weird roster shuffling occurred when Marv and Still joined for like 1 or 2 games and then left immediately after the team experienced their 6th loss, perhaps thinking they could no longer make playoffs. Marv now finds himself on the 2nd seeded team Aqualix, who obviously also made playoffs, but IzunE Fan Club still made it. They now find themselves set to face a determined CarbonX, and despite a solid pickup in Modern, my player to watch for this team, rounding out the club, I don't see them having what it takes to beat CarbonX. The team formerly known as Excel Esports, Ascendance, went from a confident 4-0 start in the season to being one of the most inconsistent teams in the entire league. They frequently go from winning in a confident fashion, such as their 16-9 win over Overnight, to a close game against the 6th seed East Coast Gaming, to getting absolutely destroyed 16-2 by Ad Astra, a team which ended 8-8. They managed to cap off their season with back-to-back wins, including knocking out RegencyCSGO Academy from playoff contention, but with how inconsistent they've been thus far, I have my doubts whether they can perform well enough in the end to beat Team Veloz Riot, their first-round matchup. Their inconsistency may benefit them in some ways, as if they decide to show up that day, we might actually have a match on our hands. But if they perform how they did versus Ad Astra, it might be over before it even begins. My player to watch for them this season would be Hardy, who has managed to break away from the rest of his team statistically and puts up a respectable 87 ADR in the regular season. But I also want to shout out PLX2, who once again, just as he did last season, holds basically all of the clutches on his team, with 12 1v1 wins and 6 1v2 wins. Now a team who had a pretty rough start, but a pretty solid finish, all things considered, is Undesired Prophecy, the 28th seed. Ever since Ninja MJ's return to the roster, they've gone from being a 1-3 roster to going 9-3, ending 10-6 total. Ninja's presence alone has shifted the fate of this roster from potentially bombing out to actually squeaking into playoffs. For that reason, he would be my player to watch from this team, because both stats-wise and otherwise, he has revitalized his team since his joining. Undesired Prophecy are set to face Arctic in the first round, where I think we can look forward to a Naseal Ninja MJ battle taking place. I think this game might be more up in the air than it appears, but Arctic is the 5 seed for a reason, and I expect they'll prove why over Undesired Prophecy in their match. Still though, props to Undesired Prophecy for shifting their season round and pulling it back. Mystic US sneaks their way into playoffs as the 27th seed after a pretty unfortunate ending to a strong season. Losing their last 2 games might make the team out to be weaker than they are, but losing to Conquest Esports and the 5th seed Arctic as your last 2 games is pretty unfortunate. That being said, they haven't beaten any teams that are worth mentioning, and have to face off against a team fully capable of beating weaker opponents in East Coast Gaming first round. As I said though, they may simply appear to be weaker than they are, because they have very few games against the top 20 teams to reference. If the team has one beacon of hope, it would be their rather top-heavy stats board so far, with Swanky and Snuffles both posting 90 ADR this season. Beyond that, though, I can't see any particular reason why Mystic will be able to beat East Coast Gaming in the first round. The 26th seeded team in playoffs, LowFlow Gaming, is a team that admittedly slipped my radar entirely this season. As a result, I have to keep their segment relatively short, but I do remember hearing them taking some solid wins over Guns N' Rage and Eros Academy back when they were at their peak as a team. Taking a look towards their season stats board, it appears that their best performer this season has been Akep, but it also appears that he's no longer playing with the roster, so my player to watch is a bit fuzzy for the squad. In the end, they have to play Project Motivate first round, but I can't say much else than that. We'll just have to wait and see how things go. Closing out the bottom 8 teams, RegencyCSGO is looking to return to their early season winning ways and make an upset happen over Redux Rising, the 8th seeded team they have to play in the first round of playoffs. Regency closed out regular season, dropping only 5 rounds in their last 2 games, but momentum can only get you so far against a team that has solidified themselves a top 8 spot, such as Redux Rising. Regency has played 2 teams in the top 10 so far, won a 16-2 loss against CarbonX, and won a close win over East Coast Gaming. If Regency is looking towards anything heading into their first main playoffs, it's probably Sayonara, who's been having an above-average season comparatively, but the skill on Redux might, in the end, be too much for Regency to overcome. A team I expected to see much higher than where they ended up, at the very least, HighQ did manage to slip into playoffs with a mid-range 10-6 seed. Despite coming close against Aqualix, and even marking themselves as one of 3 teams to beat CarbonX, they found themselves struggling against teams such as Big Bass Bonanza and 16-inch Pistols. As a result of these losses, what could have been a 12-4 season devolved into a 10-6 one, and they have to play a much harder first-round matchup than they may have had to otherwise. Frags, the matchup in question, has to be careful not to underestimate the HighQ squad though. They still have proven in the past to be able to take it to much stronger teams, and with solid clutch players on the team such as MDS and Siphon, close games might get edged in the favor of HighQ. Speaking of the players, Siphon would barely take it over MDS in the end, due to some pretty ridiculous 1v1 and 1v2 stats. Critically though, HighQ also has main playoffs experience, which Frags is lacking. I'd still favor Frags here, but the 24th seed could definitely take on the 9th seed and win, if all the conditions are right. Rin Tohsaka Academy, the 23rd seed team into playoffs, have had a favorable road to get to playoffs. Aside from an early loss to Team Veloz Riot, they managed to avoid any of the top playoff teams thus far. It's hard to gauge where this team lies in the grand scheme of things, as they have won incredibly close games against teams they probably should have performed much better against. In addition, with no real results against teams at the level they have to play in the first round of playoffs, being the lower seed, it's hard to definitively say whether they can pull off an upset. As far as standout players go, I'd have to give the shout out to T, who's playing his first full season of main with a lot of success. Mach 5 is the 22nd seeded playoffs team in main this season. They had a pretty rough early season, going 3-3, but that primed them to play much easier competition leading into the end of the season. That being said, when it comes to beating playoff teams seated below them, Mach 5 have proven they are more than capable, with wins over IzunE Fan Club, Regency, Daddy's Boyz, Rin Tohsaka Academy, and LowFlow Gaming. Also, fortunately for Mach 5, they already have had experience almost beating their first round matchup, as they will be facing Supremacy Gaming, a team that they lost 19-17 to the first time that they played earlier this season. They know that they're capable of making the upset happen, but Supremacy has the advantage of coming in with the confidence knowing they've already won. My player to watch for Mach 5 would be Hilson, who seems to be performing slightly better for the Mach 5 guys in close games, which will be much more common in this stage of the league. The 21st seeded team coming into playoffs this season also has the highest fragging player in all of main right now. Floodie's Skeet Watergun smashed their way through the start of this season, ending up 9-2 before abruptly losing 4 more games and finally ending with the highest 10-6 placement in the division. Unfortunately, despite them putting up incredible 30-plus round performances versus the likes of Aqualix, Veloz Riot, Frags, and Gemini, they didn't manage to convert a single one to be a win. And when followed up with a loss to Cygnus Esports Black as well, 16-8, you could imagine this team's morale going into playoffs might be lower than they had once thought it would be. Despite all this, the team still got as close as possible to beating many of the top 10 teams, so I would say that they're probably the strongest team on the lower end of the bracket. They have to play Materwelon in the first round of playoffs, and if you ask me, I'd say that Skeet Watergun is primed to steal the 12th seed that some might argue they even deserve. My player to watch is of course Floodie, who's having one hell of a season. However, he needs his teammates to help him in order to win out these incredibly close matches. Perhaps the best of 3 format's going to help them? It remains to be seen. But this is probably my biggest dark horse team in all of main playoffs. Originally placed at 22nd in my preseason ranking, Guns N' Rage enter the playoffs as the 20th seeded team. The lowest ranked 11-5 team in playoffs, Guns N' Rage do have a few things up their sleeves when it comes to having to pull off an upset in the first round versus in review. VTR, their AWPer, is the 4th highest fragging AWPer in main right now. The Guns N' Rage squad also has taken a win off of Project Motivate, the 7th seed, as well as taking 13 rounds off of Aqualix, the 2nd seed. Their opponents, however, are no slouches, as I'll discuss later. My player to watch for this team would be Kez, despite VTR's consistent opping. Kez brings a great personality and 93 ADR to his team, and is averaging about 0.85 frags per round. I would say that Guns N' Rage has a lot of upset potential, but definitely didn't get the greatest matchup to be able to flex that potential. If they had to play through the lower bracket, though, I think they might fare better than some might expect. Conquest is a definite first round dark horse for me, as despite their 19th seed and 11-5 record, ever since roster changes were made, they've been putting in work and have become a much more consistent team. Their first round matchup in playoffs is GODHAND, and despite being the lower seed here, I actually favor Conquest to take it over the line, but the impetus lies on GODHAND themselves to prove they are the favorites here. Regardless of who wins in the matchup, the winner is going to have to face CarbonX in the next round, which is going to be a very tough fight for either team to win. My player to watch for Conquest would be Andy, as although he's not putting up the best numbers for his team statistically, the team looks entirely changed ever since he's joined, and poised to win more games. Cygnus Esports Black has had a pretty strange path to their eventual 18th seed. At one point, the number 1 team in main, they now find themselves significantly lower than their one-time peak. After kicking my now teammate Craze for War, Cygnus went on a streak of bad losses, pulling them down from the first place and into a position where they had to fight to secure playoffs. With losses to CarbonX, Frags, and Aqualix, and a strange forfeit loss to end their season, there are way more uncertainties for this roster than there are certainties. You have to wonder whether a team that's willing to sacrifice their last game of the season, which could have boosted their seeding quite a bit, is going to give what they need in order to take wins in the playoffs. My player to watch for this squad would be B-Dog, as since he's joined, he's been consistently putting up numbers, but I would personally want to see more out of Basil and Hatchet if this team wants any chance of making it far in playoffs. Deman Esports CSGO rounds out the lower half of the playoff bracket, coming in with an 11-5 record at 17th place. The team has upgraded their roster by picking up Gank 88 and are looking pretty alright going into playoffs. Most of their losses came earlier in the season, although the losses that they have had have been to teams that ended much lower than they did in the season. And their most recent wins have all been converted on a knife's edge, going more than 27 rounds each time. The team definitely has potential, but they need to do a much more convincing job going into playoffs than they did at the end of the season. My player to watch here would probably be Gank88, who brings the highest fragging power and advanced experience to the team. Starting out the upper half of the playoffs bracket, the 16th seed Wanted Goons has had a pretty straightforward run to the playoffs. A run that featured a total of 2 playoff teams, the Goons haven't had the hardest path to the playoffs. In addition, the 2 times that they did play playoffs teams, they lost pretty convincingly. These might not be the greatest signs for the newly minted playoff team, but they do have some things going for them. Ever since picking up their newest player, IzunE, they haven't lost. In fact, in IzunE's debut match, he ended up dropping 141 ADR against Aura Gaming. I don't know his impact behind the scenes, but at the very least their morale should be high since this roster is currently undefeated in officials with their new player. For that reason, I'm also declaring IzunE as my player to watch from this team. Whatever he's bringing to the table apart from his 94 ADR and his .9 FPR, it's doing work for the Wanted Goons. They face up against Deman Esports in their first match, in what should be the closest match of the playoffs according to seeding, but who knows how close it'll actually end up being. If IzunE keeps putting up numbers though, the Goons might be able to make a dent in the upper bracket, at least until they have to play a powerhouse. Team Villainous Academy ended up having a slightly worse season than many people had expected, but coming in with the 15th seed is still absolutely a great season from the guys. Team Villainous Academy ended up having a slightly worse season than many people may have expected, but coming in with the 15th seed is still an absolutely great season from the guys. Team Villainous is another team that hasn't had too much top main competition this season, with their most notable win, in my opinion, being their OT win over In Review. Other than that, they've stomped through a lot of their wins, but have also been stomped a few times themselves. In their last 3 games, they won a close game, got a forfeit win, and lost a close game. I think that the skill and coordination this team has is still there, but they need to bring it out when it counts, which is over the next week in playoffs. They fall almost at the dead center of the pack, so they'll be playing another team who ended pretty similarly to them, the 17th seed, Cygnus, in the first round. I would still favor Villainous to win that one, if only because I feel like the skill on the Vil roster is slightly higher, and because they have playoff experience in main. My player to watch would go to my old teammate Shikes, not because he's my old teammate, but because his team has become notably stronger since he joined mid-season, and because he himself is putting up quite high stats. But coming off of a loss to a non-playoffs team, the question is whether they can bounce back. I'm also wondering how they'll end up faring against the better teams in playoffs, but they have to make it there first. GODHAND, the 14th seeded playoff team, had a decent start to the season, going 7-2, and notably winning one game 34-30, which is kinda wild. But also notably, they found themselves in some rough spots this season, as one of their players had internet or PC issues, forcing them to play 4v5 for the majority of one of their losses at the hands of last picks. They have no wins against super solid teams in playoffs, but they have a bit of time before they'll have to play against any top teams anyway. Their first matchup comes against Conquest, which I think is going to end up being pretty 50-50, as I already discussed. When it comes to players to watch from this team, it would probably go to Zim, who had quite a solid season for himself. However, I would also keep an eye on their in-game leader Koga to see whether the internet/PC issues that caused him to miss out on the majority of the last picks game will manifest once again in playoffs. I can't talk about the 13th seeded team in playoffs without talking about one of the best teams in North America, Triumph. Why, you may ask? Well, In Review, the 13th seed, played against Triumph in the most recent Cash Cup, and they managed to bring it to a 16-13 loss, where at one point it was unclear who was going to take it over the line. That in and of itself is a really positive sign for the 11-5 squad going into main playoffs. Their most notable win this season would probably come over NoPression in their 3rd match of the season. Since then, they haven't had any experience playing against top seeds, but I think that their game against Triumph shows that there's definitely a load of potential with this team. That being said, their roster is one of the most divided performance-wise that I've seen, with Jin and Penguin almost carrying their teammates across the finish line. For them to assure a strong run in playoffs, they're going to need more out of their AWPer mods, as well as South. but if Penguin and Jin have anything to say about it, In Review can still make a deep run. All I can say for sure is that Guns N' Rage, their first playoffs opponent, are probably looking at that Cash Cup match with high hopes that it was a fluke. I'm not sure how many seeds there are in the average watermelon, but I can tell you that team Materwelon decisively comes in with the 12th seed this season of Main. I'm sorry for making that joke. The highest placing 11-5 team, they come in bolstered with a forfeit win over Wacky Slush to end their season, but even without that win, they still would have made playoffs. The results are a pretty mixed bag, but it seems like they beat the teams that they should beat for the most part and lose the teams that they should lose to. Speaking of their 5 losses this season, only 2 of them came to teams currently seeded higher than them. This concerns me, as they're going to have to play against one of the strongest lower seeds in playoffs first, Skeet Watergun. But the games that they have won against the competition they've played has been pretty clean. Player to watch wise, the roster is pretty consistent across the board, so in my opinion, their performance in the playoffs falls not on their stars, but on their support players, stepping it up and performing for them to take wins. Supremacy Gaming is another team whose placement I got almost perfectly. In this instance, I originally placed them at 10th, but they ended up grabbing the 11th seed in playoffs. The lowest ranked of the 12-4 teams, their wins may not have been close, but they do sport wins over some of the stronger teams this season, including Veloz, Riot, and Frags. On the other side of the coin, though, they've lost to teams that didn't even end up making playoffs, such as Wacky Slush and Eros Academy. They technically ended this season on a win, although it was a forfeit win over 13th Hour Gaming, so their last real performance was a 16-9 loss to Motivate. All that being said, as I already discussed in my last video, these guys are no strangers to main playoffs, having appeared there for the past 6 seasons. This is their strongest placement heading into playoffs ever, though, but whether they'll be able to push themselves out of this division finally and into advanced is up in the air. My player to watch for these guys definitely isn't up in the air, though, as I'm going to have to give it once again to Pac-Man, who has been consistently performing for them season after season, and ended this season with 96 ADR. Finally, we're hitting the top 10. NoPression comes in as the 10th seed for playoffs. They had the worst start of any teams in the top 10, starting off with a 3-4 record, but from there they shockingly managed to not lose a single game, ending the season 12-4. Their games haven't always been the cleanest, and their competition not the strongest since they had a weak start, but they did manage to make a comeback happen, so you have to imagine their morale is high. Most of the players on their squad also boast advanced and even MDL experience in some of the top French-Canadian teams we've seen in CS. They certainly have the experience needed to win, and with best of 3s on the horizon, I feel like this is a team that can definitely take one of the 8 advanced spots. But it's also been a while since they've had to play a top team this season, so they may end up floundering early. It's a bit of a coin toss, but I'm leaning towards the team making it pretty damn far. My player to watch would be, interestingly, the only starter on their team without experience above main, KRL. I put him here because he's managed to not only compete with, but outperform his teammates who have had much more experience at higher levels than him. His first main playoffs is on the horizon though, so hopefully he can keep it up into best of 3s. A team who at one point held the #1 spot in main. Frags may have come in as a dark horse this season, but managed to enter playoffs as a favorite to make a very deep run. One concern I have for the guys at Frags is that although they ended with a 12-4 record, they were at one point 11-1. Their latest matches of the season proved to be too much for them, as they took losses to the 11th seed Supremacy Gaming, as well as a 16-4 loss to Veloz Riot, and a 16-14 loss to the current 1 seed Gemini. All these negatives in place, I still feel as though the team should be fine for at least the first 2 matches, but they're slated for a rematch against Gemini in the Advanced Decider match. Definitely going to be a match to look forward to seeing. My players to watch for Frags would be Maroof, who comes into playoffs after an 85 ADR season and 12 1v1 victories for his team. I also want to shout out Tarek for putting up a huge 9 1v2 wins for his team as well, but with more consistent performances overall, Maroof still earns the player to watch title for this team. Now we wait for the 3rd round of playoffs. Redux Rising, a team I initially ranked in my top 3, comes in as the 8th seed for playoffs with a middling 12-4 record. Redux had one of the best starts of any team this season, dropping just 8 rounds in their first 3 matches total with no forfeit wins. Things got a bit less stable from there though, as they took 2 of their 4 losses in a row. one to Wacky Slush and one to Aqualix, both in relatively close fashion, the Aqualix game going all 30 rounds. However, Redux managed to stabilize once again, their next loss coming 6 games later to Gemini before beating Veloz Riot, losing to East Coast Gaming, and then closing out their season with a win over CarbonX. Outside of their 16-3 loss to the side of Gemini, they've been consistently capable of bringing it to any top team this season, but they haven't always won. And in an elimination format, they can't afford to drop games anymore. There are no bonus points for close losses. They did, at least, end the season on a high note, taking one of the very few wins over CarbonX. My player to watch from this squad would have to be the same player I mention every time I talk about this squad, Shade, who edges out his teammates in terms of ADR. But as I mentioned in my preview this season, the entire team has found their form and have all performed when needed, keeping their stats board pretty tight. I personally can't wait to see whether Redux sticks the landing this season, or if they'll fail to rise to the occasion and miss out on Advanced. Project Motivate barely managed to avoid living up to the 8 in their name and come in at 7th going into playoffs. They have been shockingly consistent this season, with almost all of their games going 26 or more rounds, but they've managed to convert most of them to wins, going 12-4. Truthfully, the team managed to avoid almost every heavy hitter this season, with Supremacy, the 11th seed, as the highest seed they've even had to play. They did manage to convert that game to a win, but the question still remains whether this team will be able to compete when it matters. Still, 7th seed is nothing to scoff at. My player to watch would probably be Exotic, but most of the team falls around the same point when it comes to impact. No one particularly stands out otherwise, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Having to rely on one player to step up can cost you if they end up choking in an important match. But whether Project Motivate has it in them to make top 8 once again, this time in playoffs, remains to be seen. Yet another 12-4 team, East Coast Gaming, took the 6th seed entering playoffs. Their 4 losses were spread evenly throughout the season, falling on their 1st, 9th, 12th, and 14th games this season. Most notably, they struggled against both Gemini and Aqualix, but did manage wins over Wacky Slush and Redux Rising. They were also gifted a 16th game forfeit win over Cygnus Esports Black. Their aggressive style of play, combined with sound calling from Horeg, makes this team hard to beat cleanly, as if you can't stop them early, you end up getting run over. That being said, they are the 6th team coming in, and not the 1st, for a reason. They've shown weakness numerous times on Dust 2, and it seems like they falter against some of the stronger teams that this season has to offer. Regardless, they sit comfortably at the 6th seed, and should still make a deep run. Hornet would be my player to watch from this team regardless of the stats, but his 99 ADR this season certainly makes my decision much easier. We'll have to wait a while to see how they perform in some matches against the stronger teams, but I don't see them failing to beat some of their earlier playoff matches. I don't know if it's obvious, but my voice is starting to falter a little bit, so forgive that, but we finally hit the top 5, so here we go. Another team who didn't initially make my top 32, Arctic was just left out, placing in the B+ tier. However, it was clear that this team was onto something from the start, considering their preseason win over a premier team at the time in a qualifier. This wasn't enough to push them over the edge for me at the time, but they've certainly proved I was wrong to underestimate them. They definitely also had a rocky start to the season, going 5-4 in their first 9 games, but after a quick forfeit win over Dev's Money Crew, they managed to convert their middling season into a winning one by not dropping a single map and ending 12-4. Questions still remain for this roster, as due to their rocky early start, they ended the season with easier competition than most of the other teams in the top 10. But they can't be faulted for beating who was put in front of them. Instead, we can only look to their close losses to other teams in the top 10 that they had to play earlier. These include close losses to the 3rd, 4th, and 21st seeded teams. They seem to be able to put up a fight, but it means nothing if they can't close out. Perhaps the best of 3 format will help them take the fight to those above them, but they have to make it there first. My player to watch for this team would be Nayseal, who is head and shoulders above the rest of his teammates in the stats board, with a 94 ADR regular season under his belt in his main debut. Team Veloz Riot, initially ranked by me as the 8th best team this season, halves that by coming in as the 4th seeded main team heading into playoffs. The guys over at Veloz Riot started off the season with 2 forfeit wins right off the bat, but shortly after managed to prove that they definitely didn't need them. the squad experienced 3 losses total this season, once to CarbonX, the team that lies right above them in the seeding, as well as a loss to Supremacy Gaming and Redux Rising. They haven't had as clean of a season as some of the teams above them, with their wins going 28 plus rounds more often than not, but a win is a win in the end. Most notably, they entered the playoffs by absolutely stomping Waukee Slush 16-1, followed by Easy Frags, another top 10 playoffs team, 16-4. They seem to be in great form heading into their most important matches thus far. My player to watch would probably go to Kaki, who's been having himself a season with the AWP, but I think it's also worth mentioning that the impact that their in-game leader Kermi is bringing to the roster is insane. All in all, Veloz Riot seem poised to continue their winning ways into playoffs. CarbonX Esports secured themselves the 3rd seed this season after a 13-3 regular season. My top-ranked team going into the season, I'm not surprised to see them coming into playoffs with such a confident position. Their few losses this season were delivered to them by HighQ, Easy Frags, and Redux Rising, with the lattermost team sporting the most decisive win, a 16-9 affair. Regardless, CarbonX have been unwavering this season, taking wins over many of the teams in the top 10, including the 2nd seed, Aqualix. My player to watch for this squad would be Davenport University's newest signing, Kojomo, who led his team with a solid 94 ADR and 373 frags to his name. This season of Main was certainly defined by strong oppers, with 4 of the top 5 fragging oppers in Main taking top 20 spots in playoffs, and the top 3 occupying the top 3 slots. Kojomo and Co. have been boastful from start to finish that they would live up to my ranking and win this season of Main. They have a long road still to go to prove if they can, but they've set themselves up well for a deep run here in the playoffs. Entering playoffs with the 2nd seed is Aqualix Esports, who dropped only 2 maps all season, leaving them with a 14-2 record. Their 2 losses came at the hands of NoPression, the 10th seed, and CarbonX, the 3rd seed. This team is by no means unstoppable, but it certainly may feel that way when you run into them in the server and earn less than 10 rounds, like the majority of their opposition this season. And as the only playoffs team with a win over the 1st seed, they should be feeling confident taking on anyone. They also just brought in Marv, who hopped around a few teams before eventually landing on Aqualix 4 games ago. He's been having a season of his own individually, but now finds himself on a team that can match his performance. This team has a lot going for it, including having the highest fragging opera in Main this season, Dopex. My player to watch, however, would have to be Royal one of the most successful entry fraggers in Main this season, who brings explosive firepower to any bomb site his enemies have the displeasure of running into him on. Finally, we reach the 1st seed. Ending their regular season with a 14-2 record, Gemini have certainly taken me, and I'm sure many others, by surprise. By no means a team lacking skill, they did unfortunately slip under my radar in the preseason rankings, but due in large part to undeniably incredible seasons coming out of both FN Snad and Gertz, they cruised past most of their competition this season, losing a total of 2 games. Their first loss came incredibly early in the season, where they fell in overtime to Kinship Arctic, a team who's now marked dead by ESEA. Perhaps an uncharacteristic loss knowing what we know now, but they managed to bounce back and win the following 12 games back-to-back. Their 2nd and final loss of the season so far came at the hands of the team we just discussed, Aqualix, in a brutally close 16-14 fashion. One thing of note is that both of their losses came on Dust 2, which might just speak to the random nature of the map. However, Gemini's overall record on it is 4-2, meaning that even on their potentially weakest map, they still have a winning record, including an unreal 16-3 stomp over Redux Rising and a 16-6 over East Coast Gaming, both top 10 teams. Looking towards playoffs, my eyes definitely fall on Snad and Gertz to see if they can keep up their form into the all too important playoff matches. One last thing is that they have notably avoided playing CarbonX thus far, meaning that we might have to wait until late into playoffs to see both of those titans square off. Well, there you have it. All 32 teams and their players to watch discussed in full. Thanks to everyone for watching this all the way through, and to everyone who has supported me in both my content creation efforts and my CS related ones. Once again, if you like this, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at NoVa__FPS and follow CounterNature for more amateur Counter-Strike content. Also, shameless plug, I'm looking for an advanced team, hit me up. Anyway, good luck to all teams and let the games begin. I'm going to go take a rest because I literally feel like I'm about to pass out from talking for the past, 35 minutes? Anyway, I'll catch you all on the next video. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Peace out.